What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the Tree of Life.
In the basement of a museum in Berlin, there are clay tablets sitting in wooden drawers that have not been seriously read in over 4,000 years. Not because scholars forgot about them, not because they are too damaged to examine, but because no living human being has ever had the tools to fully understand what they say. Until now, what an AI system recently extracted from those tablets does not just add a footnote to ancient history. It threatens to rewrite the entire first chapter of human civilization. Hi, my name is Matthew, and this is Reef Discovery, the Sumerian civilization. What we thought we knew. Let me set the scene for you. Around 5,000 years ago, in the flat, sun-baked land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, something happened that we have never been able to fully explain. A civilization emerged seemingly out of nowhere with cities, laws, organized religion, agricultural systems, a professional class of administrators, and most importantly, writing. We call these people the Sumerians, and for over a century, historians have credited them with essentially inventing civilization as a concept. The wheel, the plow, the first music legal codes, the first schools, the first libraries, the first recorded love poem, which for the record is about a king and a goddess and is considerably more explicit than your high school English teacher would have been comfortable with. You are welcome for that detail. The Sumerians wrote everything down, and they wrote it in a script called cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped, named for the distinctive marks made by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay. Those clay tablets were then dried or fired, which is why so many of them survive. Clay, it turns out, is an excellent archival medium. Better than paper, better than parchment, better in many ways than digital storage, which is a humbling thought. Hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been recovered from archaeological sites across the ancient Near East. They are currently housed in museums and universities across the world. The British Museum has over 130,000 of them. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad has tens of thousands more. The Border Asiatics Museum in Berlin has thousands. Universities in Philadelphia, Chicago, Paris, and Istanbul have entire collections that represent lifetimes of potential research. These tablets contain administrative records, tax documents, religious hymns, medical texts, astronomical observations, legal codes, mythological narratives, letters between merchants, and texts we have not even begun to categorize properly. Here is what most people do not realize. The majority of these tablets have never been fully translated. Not because historians are lazy, not because funding has been withheld, though that is also a problem, but because translating ununiform is extraordinarily difficult, and the number of scholars in the entire world who are genuinely fluent in ancient Sumerian can be counted in the hundreds. A few hundred specialists working against hundreds of thousands of tablets. You do not need to be a mathematician to see that this equation does not work out. For over a century and a half since cuneiform music was first deciphered in the 1850s, scholars have been chipping away at this mountain of untranslated knowledge. And what they found through traditional methods already rewrote history multiple times. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered in the 1870s, contained a flood narrative strikingly similar to the story of Noah, predating the biblical version by at least 1,000 years. Legal codes from Sumerian music cities established principles of justice and property rights that we thought originated in Greece. Mathematical tablets showed knowledge of geometry that we previously attributed to the Pythagoreans. Each translation was a small earthquake in our understanding of human history, but they were coming slowly, painfully slowly, one scholar, one tablet, one painstaking line at a time. Then artificial intelligence entered the room and the slow drip became a flood. The translation problem. Why these tablets stumped scholars for 150 years. To understand why the AI breakthrough matters so much, you need to appreciate exactly how difficult ununiform actually is to translate. I want to be honest with you here because I think popular science coverage often waves past this part. And the difficulty is the whole point. Ununiform is not an alphabet. It is a mixed system combining logographic signs where one symbol represents an entire word or concept with syllabic signs where symbols represent sounds that combine to form words. The same sign can mean completely different things depending on context, surrounding signs, the period it was written in, and the regional dialect of the scribe who wrote it. Ancient Sumerian was spoken for roughly 1,000 years before it became a purely written language preserved by scribes who no longer spoke it as a mother tongue. Think about what that means. We are trying to decode a dead language that was being written by people for whom it was already a dead language. It is like finding a library of medieval Latin manuscripts copied by monks who had only only ever read Latin, never spoken it, and were working from earlier manuscripts that were themselves copies of copies. Then there is the physical problem. Many tablets are damaged, edges are broken, sections are missing. Some tablets were deliberately written in abbreviated shorthand that assume the reader already knew the full context. Some contain technical vocabulary from professions that no longer exist, using terminology with no surviving explanation. And here is what really kept scholars up at night. Ununiform script changed significantly over its 3,000-year history. A tablet from 2800 BCE looks completely different from a tablet written in 600 BCE. Even if both are technically Cuneiform, scholars need to identify the period, the region, the genre, and the dialect before they can even begin reading. Every tablet is its own puzzle before the actual translation puzzle begins. A single specialist might spend an entire academic career producing authoritative translations of a few hundred tablets. Given that there are hundreds of thousands waiting, the math is genuinely depressing. At the rate of traditional scholarship, we would need centuries just to get through what is already sitting in museum storage. Some tablets had been sitting in museum drawers since they were excavated in the late 1800s and early 1900s, cataloged, numbered, and then essentially shelved because there simply was not enough human expertise to process them. Important tablets, potentially groundbreaking tablets, gathering dust in conditions that, while better than an Iraqi archaeological site, are still not ideal for 4,000-year-old clay. Scholars knew this was a crisis. They knew that critical knowledge was locked inside these objects. They knew that the gap between what had been found and what had been understood was enormous and growing. But they could not solve a human capacity problem with more humans. There were not enough humans with the right skills. What they needed was something that could read millions of examples simultaneously, recognize patterns across tens of thousands of tablets at once, cross-reference linguistic databases in real time, and never get tired, never retire, and never have a departmental funding crisis. What they needed, it turns out, was exactly what they got. Enter the AI. What technology was used and how. In 2023, a team of researchers at the Babylonian Engine Project, working in collaboration with computational linguists and astrobiologists, deployed a large language model specifically trained on every digitized cuneiform text available, every known lexical list, every grammar reference, every scholarly translation produced over 150 years of cuneiform studies. The model was music, not a general-purpose AI that happened to look at some tablets. It was purpose-built and purpose-rated. Think of the difference between asking a generalist doctor to perform brain surgery and asking a neurosurgeon. The distinction matters enormously when the stakes are this high. The training data included the entire digital corpus of ununiform mathematical texts, the Ununiform Digital Library Initiative database, the State Archives of Assyria, published translations from the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and thousands of scholarly papers analyzing specific linguistic features of ancient Sumerian and Akkadian, which was the language that largely replaced Sumerian, but was written using the same ununiform script. The AI was given something human scholars had never had before: complete simultaneous access to every known ununiform text in digitized form, cross-referenced against every known translation with the ability to identify statistical patterns in sign usage, context, and meaning across the entire corpus at once. Human scholars build expertise gradually, decade by decade, text by text, learning patterns intuitively through years of immersive study. The AI absorbed the equivalent of every ununiform scholar's lifetime of work simultaneously, and then began identifying patterns that no individual human could hold in their head at one time. What happened next surprised even the researchers who built the system. When the AI was applied to previously untranslated or music, partially translated tablets, particularly tablets that had been classified as too damaged, too abbreviated, or too technically obscure for reliable human translation, it began producing readings that were not just plausible, they were stunning. Scholars who reviewed the AI outputs described a feeling of reading something familiar and completely alien at the same time, like recognizing a face in a photograph from a place you have never been. And what the AI found in those tablets falls into three categories, each one more disturbing than the last. The first shock: medical knowledge that should not exist. The tablets that produced the first major shock were a collection housed partly in the British Museum and partly in the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Museum. They had been tentatively identified decades ago as medical texts, which was already known. Mesopotamian medicine was an established field of study. We knew the Sumerians and later Babylonians had physicians and pharmacological knowledge. What we did not know was the depth and precision of that knowledge, because the tablets that scholars had translated using traditional methods represented, as the AI analysis revealed, roughly 30% of the actual medical content on those tablets. The remaining 70% had been classified as too damaged, too idiomatic, or too specialized to translate reliably. The AI translated it, and what it found fundamentally changes our timeline of medical science. The tablets contain detailed diagnostic frameworks that do not just describe symptoms. They establish causal relationships between observations and underlying conditions in a way that anticipates clinical reasoning by 2,000 years. One series of tablets, which the AI was able to read as a connected sequence for the first time because it could recognize that several damaged tablets in different museum collections were actually parts of the same original text, describes a diagnostic protocol for what we would today recognize as liver disease. The protocol instructs the physician to observe the color of the patient's eyes, the texture and color of their skin, the nature of their urine, whether the abdomen is distended, and whether the patient experiences pain in a specific region of the body. It then correlates these observations with a prognosis and a treatment. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where these stories can go wrong. I am not saying the Sumerians had hospitals like ours, or that they understood germ theory, or that their treatments were effective by modern standards. Many of them involved incantations and ritual alongside herbal preparations, and that is completely consistent with Bronze Age medicine everywhere in the world. What I am saying is that the diagnostic framework, the systematic observation of multiple correlated symptoms to identify a specific internal condition, is more sophisticated than anything we previously attributed to this period. Greek medicine, specifically the Hippocratic tradition, which we have always credited with founding music systematic clinical diagnosis, postdates these tablets by roughly 1,500 years. But that is not the most disturbing finding. The AI identified a series of tablets describing something that scholars had previously translated vaguely as treatments for the shaking disease. Traditional translations had interpreted this as a ritual description of epilepsy, which we already knew the Mesopotamians recognized. The AI's full translation revealed something different. The shaking disease texts described two distinct conditions with different onset patterns, different accompanying symptoms, and crucially different treatments. One condition responds to a specific herbal preparation. The other does not, and the text explicitly states this and explains why the treatment that works for the first condition will not work for the second. What the AI translated is, in functional terms, a differential diagnosis. The recognition that two conditions can look similar but are fundamentally different and require different interventions. We date the formal development of differential diagnostic reasoning in Western medicine to the 19th century CE. The tablets describing it are 4,000 years old. The second shock astronomical calculations beyond their time. If the medical findings were a quiet earthquake, the astronomical findings were the one that collapses buildings. We already knew that Mesopotamian astronomers were sophisticated. The Babylonian astronomical tradition is well documented. We know they tracked planetary movements, predicted eclipses, and developed mathematical models for celestial mechanics. The anti-their mechanism gets all the press, but honestly, Babylonian astronomy deserves far more credit than it typically receives in popular history. What the AI translations revealed is that the sophistication of early Sumerian astronomical knowledge from a period predating the classical Babylonian tradition by over 1,000 years was far more advanced than anything our existing translated records suggested. A collection of tablets in the Berlin Museum. Tablets that had been catalogued as administrative records related to agricultural scheduling, which is why no one had prioritized fully translating them, turned out to contain something else entirely embedded within the administrative context. The AI recognized a pattern of numbers appearing throughout these tablets that did not fit agricultural scheduling at all. What it recognized was a positional number system being used to record precise astronomical observations. The numbers, when decoded in the correct base 60 format that Sumerian mathematics used, describe the positions of Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus against fixed star backgrounds across a period of observations spanning multiple decades. Let me explain why this matters. To record planetary positions with this kind of precision across decades requires systematic, organized, multi-generational observation. You cannot do it alone. You cannot do it without a methodology for recording and comparing observations consistently over time. You need an institution, a tradition, a school of practice that passes knowledge from one generation to the next with enough rigor to maintain the precision of the observations. The tablets the AI analyzed date to approximately 2900 BCE. That is nearly 3,000 years before the astronomical revolution we associate with Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. It is more than 000 years before the classical Babylonian period whose astronomical sophistication we already acknowledged. But here is where the AI found something that stopped researchers cold. Embedded within these astronomical records were calculations that the AI's mathematical analysis identified as consistent with heliocentric modeling. Not a full heliocentric theory in the way Copernicus articulated it. Not a written philosophical argument that the sun is at the center of the solar system, but a mathematical treatment of planetary motion that makes more computational sense if the calculator assumes a sun-centered reference frame than if they assume an Earth-centered one. This is deeply controversial. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Mainstream scholars who have reviewed these findings have not universally accepted this interpretation. Some argue that the mathematical patterns the AI identified can be explained within a geocentric framework using sufficiently sophisticated epicycle calculations. This is a real and serious objection that deserves to be taken seriously. But here is the problem with that objection. The epicycle mathematics required to explain these observations from a geocentric position are themselves extraordinarily complex, more complex than anything we had previously attributed to this period. Either the Sumerians had proto-heliocentric intuitions, or they had geocentric mathematics more sophisticated than anything we thought existed for another 2,000 years. Either way, something in our timeline of scientific development is wrong. The third shock, the creation texts say something different. This is the part that is going to stay with you. The Sumerian creation myths are among the most studied texts in the ancient world. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic derived from earlier Sumerian sources. The story of Enki and the creation of humanity. The narratives describing the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon. Scholars have translated, debated, and analyzed these texts for over a century. Or rather, they translated the portions they could access, the portions that were legible, that matched known vocabulary, that fit within established frameworks for understanding Sumerian religious literature. The AI translated the rest, and what the full texts say is significantly different from the summaries and partial translations that have shaped our understanding of Sumerian cosmology. The creation narratives, in their complete AI-translated form, describe a process of human creation that is explicitly technological in its language, not metaphorically technological, not symbolically technological. The vocabulary the AI identified, cross-referenced against technical terminology, appearing in Sumerian craft and construction texts from the same period, describes manipulation of living material in a way that uses the same root words and grammatical structures as Sumerian texts, describing the deliberate modification of plants for agricultural purposes. Zechariah Sitchin spent decades arguing that the Sumerian texts describe genetic engineering by extraterrestrial beings. I am not going there. That is not what the AI found, and responsible reporting on this requires me to be clear about the distinction. Sitchin's translations were not accepted by mainstream Asiologists, and the AI analysis does not vindicate his specific claims. What the AI found is something more subtle and in some ways more unsettling. The complete creation texts describe the Anunnaki not as gods in the supernatural sense that later religious tradition interpreted them, but as a class of beings whose power is explicitly attributed to their knowledge and technique. The word that has traditionally been translated as divine or godly appears in these full texts in contexts where the AI's linguistic analysis suggests the more accurate translation is something closer to possessing advanced skill or mastery of hidden processes. The Anunnaki are described as beings who knew things that other beings did not know, who could do things others could not do, whose authority derived not from supernatural origin, but from the possession and control of specific knowledge. This matters because it changes what these texts are actually about. If the Anunnaki represent a class of knowledge holders whose power came from technical mastery, then the Sumerian creation myths are not primarily supernatural narratives. They are social and historical documents describing a knowledge hierarchy, a world in which some beings possessed capabilities that appeared miraculous to others because the underlying knowledge was controlled and not shared, which raises a question that the AI cannot answer but that the full translation makes unavoidable. Where did that knowledge come from? If the earliest Sumerian texts describe a pre-existing class of technically sophisticated beings whose knowledge founded music civilization, and if those texts predate any civilization we can identify in the archaeological record that could have generated such knowledge, then we are missing something. We are missing something significant, and we have been missing it because we were only reading 30% of what the tablets actually said. The mainstream response and why it makes things worse. Now, I want to be fair here because the temptation in a story like this is to frame mainstream academics as the villains, the gatekeepers protecting comfortable theories from disruptive truths. And that framing is almost always too simple and usually wrong. Most Assyriologists who have engaged seriously with the AI translation work have not rejected it. They have engaged with it cautiously, professionally, and in many cases productively. Several leading scholars have published responses acknowledging that the AI outputs are generating genuinely new readings of difficult texts, and that some of those readings are philologically defensible in ways that demand serious engagement. That is the response of a healthy discipline confronting new evidence, and it deserves acknowledgement. But there is a smaller and unfortunately louder response that is less admirable. A defensive reaction from a segment of the academic establishment that is treating the AI translations not as evidence to be evaluated but as a threat to be managed. Scholars who have spent careers building interpretive frameworks around the partial translations we had are understandably reluctant to accept that those frameworks may have been built on incomplete foundations. One prominent Assyriologist writing in an academic journal response to the Babylonian Engine Project's initial published findings argued that AI translation tools, however however sophisticated, cannot replicate the contextual judgment that human scholars develop through years of immersive study, that they generate plausible-sounding outputs that may not reflect genuine linguistic competence, that the field should be cautious about sensationalizing machine-generated readings of already controversial texts. These are not unreasonable points. They are worth taking seriously. But here is what makes the resistance itself revealing. The same scholars who are most cautious about the AI translations are, when pressed, also the most reluctant to formally acknowledge the scale of the untranslated corpus. To stand up in public and say clearly, we have hundreds of thousands of tablets we cannot read, and we do not have the human capacity to read them in any reasonable time frame. And therefore, we have been drawing conclusions about Sumerian civilization from a fundamentally incomplete data set. Because acknowledging that would mean acknowledging that everything we have taught about the origins of civilization, medicine, astronomy, law, and religion for the past 150 years has been built on a partial picture. And a partial picture that we knew was partial, but perhaps did not sufficiently disclose in the confident textbooks and museum placards and documentary narrations that shaped public understanding. That is an uncomfortable thing to admit, and discomfort in any field can look a lot like caution from the inside. What this means for everything. Let us take a step back and think about what the complete picture actually implies, because I think it is easy to get lost in the specific findings and miss the larger point that connects all of them. We have built our entire understanding of human intellectual development on a timeline, a sequence in which specific capabilities emerged at specific moments. Writing around 3200 BCE, systematic medicine around 400 BCE with Hippocrates, mathematical astronomy around 300 BCE with the Greeks, sophisticated cosmological thinking around the time of the great philosophical traditions. This timeline was not invented arbitrarily. It was derived from the evidence available, from the texts that had been successfully translated, from the monuments that had been excavated and interpreted, from the material culture that had been recovered and analyzed. But the AI translations reveal that this timeline was constructed from an incomplete data set in a specific and directional way. The texts that were easiest to translate, the more formulaic administrative records, the simpler literary texts, the shorter and less damaged tablets, were necessarily the first to be understood. The more complex, more technical, more damaged, and more linguistically challenging texts, precisely the ones most likely to contain advanced knowledge, were the ones that remained untranslated. We built our timeline of human intellectual development from the easiest texts to read. And the easiest texts to read are not the most sophisticated ones. The implications ripple outward in every direction. If Sumerian medical knowledge was more sophisticated than we thought, then the Greek medical tradition was not an origin point. It was a revival or a partial recovery of something older. If Sumerian astronomical mathematics was more advanced than we thought, then the Babylonian tradition that we do credit with significant astronomical achievement was itself building on an even earlier foundation that we missed entirely. If the Sumerian creation texts describe a knowledge hierarchy rather than a supernatural mythology, then the relationship between Mesopotamian religion and the later Abrahamic traditions that derive from the same cultural sphere becomes significantly more complex and more interesting. None of this requires aliens. None of this requires lost continents or secret ancient masters. What it requires is something both simpler and more confronting. The acknowledgement that human beings 4,000 and 5,000 years ago were more capable, more knowledgeable, and more sophisticated than the version of them we have been comfortable teaching. And that we missed this not through malice, but through the perfectly understandable limitation of translating only what we had the tools to translate, the tablets we have not translated yet. Here is the part that should keep you awake at night. And I say this as someone who has spent weeks researching this topic and genuinely cannot stop thinking about it. I apologize in advance for doing the same to you. The tablets analyzed by the AI in the Babylonian Engine project represent a fraction of the total untranslated cuneiform corpus. A significant fraction by the standards of what has previously been processed. Yes, but a fraction nonetheless. Current estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 1 million ununiform tablets have been recovered from archaeological sites. Of these, somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 have been meaningfully translated and published in scholarly literature. That means between 350,000 and 850,000 tablets remain essentially unread. These tablets are sitting right now in the basement and storage facilities of museums on 4 continents. Some of them are in stable, climate-controlled conditions. Some of them are not. Some of them are in collections in Iraq that have faced enormous disruption from conflict and institutional instability over the past 3 decades, and whose condition and accessibility possibility is uncertain. Some of them were excavated over a century ago by archaeologists who were primarily interested in monumental architecture and treated the tablets as secondary finds, cataloging them hastily and moving on. Some of them are fragments so small and damaged that even the AI has limited data to work with. But they are there. Hundreds of thousands of them containing what we genuinely do not know. We do not know because we have not read them. And for 150 years, we told ourselves a story about ancient Sumer based on the ones we could read without adequately flagging how much of the story we were simply skipping over. There is a moment in the research for this video that I keep coming back to. Not a dramatic revelation or a shocking finding, just a description from one of the researchers on the Babylonian engine project of the first time they fed a long-damaged, previously untranslatable tablet into the system and received a coherent reading back. She described sitting there looking at texts that had not been understood by any human being in 4,000 years. Words written by someone who was alive during what we call the early dynastic period of Sumer. A person who had a name, a daily routine, thoughts and concerns, and a specific area of expertise that we are only now beginning to recover. And she said the feeling was not triumph. It was something closer to grief. Grief for all the time lost. All the questions that could have been asked sooner. All the assumptions that could have been questioned earlier if only we had had the tools. The AI did not discover that ancient people were smarter than we thought. Ancient people were always smarter than we thought. The AI just gave us a way to finally listen to what they were saying. And what they were saying is that the story of human civilization is older, deeper, richer, and more complex than the version we have been comfortable telling ourselves. The first chapter was not written in Greece. It was not written in Rome. It was pressed into clay tablets in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley by people whose full voice we are only now finally beginning to hear. The tablets spoke. For 4,000 years, we did not have the ears to listen. Now we do, and what they are telling us changes everything. My name is Matthew. This is Reef Discovery. And if this made you look at human history differently, it should, because that is exactly what the evidence demands.